be here and worship at the Second Baptist today. Stephanie, thank you for the kind introduction. You probably have heard rumors that I'm not from around here. I grew up in North Carolina, have ministered in North Carolina and Virginia and Georgia. I bring that up to tell you that you don't have to be from West Texas to know about this congregation. Because long before I was in leadership in Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, I had heard of your faith, I had known of your witness, and I had been eager to be here to experience worship with you and to have a sense of the life of this congregation. And I want you to know it is a privilege to represent your larger Cooperative Baptist Fellowship family here today and to let you know that our fellowship family is praying for you and with you during these days of transition. We're praying for your search committee, and we're doing so with confidence because we believe that although this congregation's witness in your history up till now has been remarkable and beautiful, we follow a God who still is in the business of doing new things. And we're eager to see what new kind of courageous and loving faith comes from this congregation. Your congregation is a leader in the Baptist movement that created Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. So it is a privilege to be here and to offer my gratitude to you and for you. One sign of that gratitude is that I don't have a denominational commercial with me today. Instead, I want to invite you to pay very careful attention to the way John, who wrote the Revelation, described Jesus in these opening verses of his rather remarkable letter. He describes Jesus as a faithful witness. And I think we would agree that Jesus throughout his life and ministry exhibited faithfulness in the way he used his words to bear witness to the power of God. And he describes Jesus as the firstborn of the dead, a testimony to Jesus' resurrection on the third day. But then the preacher who wrote the Revelation drops in this phrase. He also describes Jesus as the ruler of the kings of earth. And I have one of those preacher theories this morning that I can't prove, but you can't disprove. I think when those 7 congregations in Asia first listened to this remarkable document read aloud, before they had any clue of what was coming in the next chapters. That's another sermon series. Ask Charlie to preach that series. That'd be fun. Before you get to any of that, I think when they heard the phrase that Jesus is the ruler of the kings of earth, I think they sat at rapt attention, probably in a mixture of awe and fear. Because you see, even if you listen to the rest of the Revelation, you will not hear this particular phrase again in relationship to Jesus. Now, toward the end of Revelation, you will hear a very similar phrase that describes Jesus coming on the clouds as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. I think the language King of Kings and Lord of Lords at the end of the Revelation is a parallel to ruler of the kings of earth at the beginning of Revelation. It is undeniably a statement of what the high-powered scholars would describe as the highest Christology. That is to say, Christ is above everything else. Christ is the highest authority. Christ is the greatest power. Christ is the ruler of all other rulers, the King of all other kings, and the Lord of all other lords. That's why I think the congregation leaned forward in awe. Now I'm going to tell you why I think they leaned forward in terror. You see, in the time that those 7 churches in Asia were receiving this rather fascinating letter we call the Revelation to John, the Roman Empire was at its height. And the Roman emperor had a habit of referring to himself as the ruler of the kings of the earth. The Roman emperor had a habit of expecting all of his subjects, both those who belonged to Greco-Roman religious traditions and those who came from other backgrounds, to bow down and worship him literally. That he actually had the expectation that in any city where there was a statue or an image of the emperor constructed, any subject had an obligation to stop and bow down and offer reverence. Now, this congregation, I'm told, has a history of really skilled preaching. A whole series of preachers, time would not allow me to name them all, who demonstrate the importance of being careful about our words. So I wonder if you all will agree with me that it's probably not by accident that the writer of the Revelation uses this phrase, ruler of the kings of earth, to describe Jesus in a very moment when other rulers in the world were using the same phrase and the same kind of language to describe themselves and try to command obedience to themselves. I want to suggest to you, I can't put it in the form of a motion because we're not in a church conference, and I wouldn't have any standing if we were because I'm not a member. I don't think this is by accident. And I don't think it's preacher rhetoric. I think it's an intentional decision by the author of Revelation to draw a line in the sand and say, no, there is only one who is the ruler of the kings of earth, and it's not the Roman emperor. It is Jesus Christ, crucified, dead, buried, and on the 3rd day, risen again. Ascended into heaven, where now seats at the right hand of God. Well, at the time that Revelation was written, it was not just that you had other voices in the world claiming to be the ruler of the kings of the earth. You also had a group of people running around these self-same churches in Asia who were called the Nicolaitans. If you read Revelation 2 and 3 in the letters to the churches, you'll see them mentioned. I told the crowd at 8:30 that we moderate to progressive Baptists have a really interesting history with Revelation. We read the first several chapters and the last 2 chapters, and we skip the rest. We construct a bypass around the rest. I can't solve that problem today, but if you read the letters to the 7 churches, there goes the microphone. If you read the letters to the 7 churches, you will see the Nicolaitans referenced. And the Nicolaitans were a group of what you might describe as pragmatic people, because they understood that they belonged to a faith tradition, namely Christianity, that believed that Jesus was Lord, that Jesus was the ruler of the kings of earth. They'd heard this kind of sermon, but they also know they lived in what they believed was the real world, where the Roman emperor was in charge, and if the Roman emperor was going to destroy you, you couldn't get anything done. So they advocated, that they actually encouraged Christians to try to worship the Roman emperor and worship Jesus at the same time. The expensive word for that in the scholarship is assimilation. That is to say, yes, you can say with your lips on Sunday, you can sing all the hymns that Jesus is the ruler of the kings of earth and he is King of kings and Lord of lords, Alpha and Omega, all of that, and then go out and bow down to that statue of the Roman emperor, because if you don't exist, you can't get anything done, right? You got to go along to get along. You got to make some deals. You got to be willing to be. You got to be willing to be a citizen of the world in which you live. You could find a way. Don't take the risk. Don't refuse to bow down. Let's just say the preacher of Revelation doesn't think much of that view. Read what he said about it in the letter to the Laodiceans toward the end of chapter 3. It's in that kind of world where there are political leaders speaking like they think they are God and preachers suggesting that you got to go along to get along, that the preacher to the Revelation opens this letter by saying, no. Jesus and Jesus alone is the ruler of the kings of earth. Jesus and Jesus alone is worthy of our worship. Jesus and Jesus alone should be the object of our obedience. Jesus and no other power, Jesus and no other name, Jesus Christ alone is ruler of the kings of earth. So do you see why I think the congregation didn't fall asleep early in the sermon that is the Revelation of John? They knew what the preacher was doing. The preacher was challenging the voices of his time, voices in the church and voices outside the church that would take people's attention away from the singular lordship of Jesus and the unique power of Jesus. So I'm wondering, as we gather for worship today, how the opening of the Revelation speaks to us and challenges us. And I want to be clear, I understand very well that we don't live in the first century Roman Empire. For one thing, in the first century Roman Empire, and even in the New Testament Christianity, I love it when Baptist preachers say they want to be part of a New Testament church. I don't think they're serious, by the way. But in a New Testament church, it would have been unimaginable that anybody who identified as a follower of Jesus would have ever been in charge of any government. The first century Christians were a profound minority movement in the early Christian world. They were not on the radar. They didn't have political influence. They couldn't have possibly imagined that one of their type, one of their allegiance would have ever been in charge of any government. Unimaginable. And democracy hadn't even crossed anybody's mind. So religiously and politically, we live in a very different world than the world in which John wrote the Revelation, but we still live in a world where there are many voices describing themselves as the ultimate authority. We still live in a world where there are kings of the earth who act like they are gods. We still live in a world where there are voices that want us to give our full allegiance to some political power or some political personality or some political cause. And there are still plenty great spiritual grandchildren of the Nicolaitans running around in the world today who are saying, well, you can absolutely worship Jesus on Sunday and you can absolutely do whatever you have to do to go along and get along every other day and every other place, because if you're not here, what good is it? So as I stand in our world today and I listen to these opening verses of Revelation, I find myself first being challenged. Because I found myself being challenged to recognize that no authentic Christian witness should be co-opted. That no authentic Christian witness should allow us to give off the impression that we think any power other than Jesus is ultimate. That any power other than Jesus has a right to direct our lives. We ought to be people who understand that Christ is Lord of all, and it's our commitment to Jesus that dictates how we will respond to everything and everyone else, because He is Lord and not us and not them. We live in a world where there are many kings of the earth who want to co-opt the church. And unfortunately, there are many, many religious leaders of all stripes who are willing to do just about whatever it does to get the approval of the political leaders of the earth, as though somehow their power was ultimate and somehow the church needed it to carry out its ministry. I mean, what do you think the early Christians in Acts would have thought if someone had suggested, hey, don't heal people, don't preach, don't break out in love because we don't have legislation that supports it? If they had waited for the permission of the government, we wouldn't be here. If they had thought the power of the Roman Empire was ultimate, they would have never made it out of the first century. They knew what it was to live as people who knew where the ultimate power was. They weren't for sale. They weren't available. They were not willing to be co-opted. They were courageous and bold and faithful. I think the co-opting tendencies in Christian life today are laid bare by this text from Revelation because it challenges us to remember who the ultimate authority really is, where our identity really comes, which means this text from Revelation also challenges the pulverizing partisanship that's ripping apart this nation and many nations of the world. You see, partisanship has its source in the belief that a political party is ultimate, or some politician is ultimate. And by the way, that can be true of whatever color politicians you think you prefer. That's actually a multi-partisan observation. Partisanship presumes that my ultimate identity is my registration or my political affiliation. Partisanship of that kind of extreme, pulverizing kind is a cousin of tribalism. It reminds me, and I shared in the early service, of the terrible genocide in Rwanda, late in the last millennium, but still a very fresh memory. Some of you know that Rwanda was the most evangelized nation by Western Christian missionaries in Africa. Some of you know that it was laid bare by the colonialistic and imperialistic efforts of countries in Western Europe. Some of you, all of us know that there was a terrifying genocide that began in that nation in the 1990s. What we don't often know is that because the nation was so evangelized, there were people of different tribal backgrounds who claimed some affiliation with Jesus. So they were all at church for worship on Sunday, Easter Sunday albeit. And then in the days that came, they took up machetes and killed each other. Emmanuel Katongole, a Catholic priest from Africa, wrote a book about 20 years ago called Mirror to the Church, Lessons for the Western Church from the Rwandan Genocide. It is a terrifying read. And it's not hard. The things that scare me the most are not the hardest things to understand. Katongole's explanation was that what went wrong in Rwanda was that the blood of tribalism ran deeper than the waters of baptism. In other words, that for people in Rwanda, their ultimate identity marker was not that they were followers of Jesus. The ultimate identity marker was tribal. The ultimate identity marker did not come from their faith in Christ. It came from something else. So that caused them to turn against one another in a violence that clearly has nothing to do with the love of Jesus or the fruit of the Spirit. Well, partisanship in our part of the world as of today has not yet involved machetes, although there is a terrifying escalation of violence in our world. But it has turned violent in speech. And even people who say that Jesus Christ is Lord are speaking about themselves and speaking of one another in ways that are unmistakably violent and take people far, far away from someone who traveled the Galilee and said, "Love one another as I have loved you." By this, all people will know you're my disciples if you have love for one another. If Jesus Christ is really the ruler of the kings of the earth, then that means that our sense of identity, our allegiance is higher than partisanship. It means that we see ourselves as followers of Him above all. So we're challenged. But in good Baptist fashion, we also hear a calling. Do you hear the latter part of the text from Revelation 1? It says, He, the ruler of the kings of earth, made us to be a kingdom of priests serving God and giving God glory. So as followers of Jesus in a very challenging moment, our calling is to use our voices and live our lives in ways that not only reflect the lordship of Jesus Christ, but give glory and honor and dominion to God, the only one to whom it belongs. It is a calling that affects how we speak. It's a calling that pushes us to live in different ways. And it's a calling for which congregations like yours are uniquely suited. And it's not just you in West Texas. In my work with Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, I get to travel to a large number of congregations that are in different parts of the country, of different sizes, that dress differently for worship, that sing different songs. And you know what else is true about those congregations? I bet is true about the one I'm standing in today. They didn't all vote the same way in the last election. And they didn't all feel the same way about how they voted. In fact, where 2 or 3 Baptist and CBF congregations are gathered together, there are usually 4 or 5 different ways of voting among them and 8 or 10 different feelings about those 4 or 5 different ways of voting. And yet, you know what those congregations do? They do something that's increasingly rare in our world. In a time when everyone else is pushing away, they somehow come together, and y'all, that's not natural. The elemental spirits of the universe, the headwinds, are not blowing people who are different toward one another. They're turning us against each other in violence. But somehow in these remarkable congregations, the lordship of Christ is still clearly enough established that people who don't think exactly the same way or vote exactly the same way or feel exactly the same way come together to do the work of God in their communities in a way that is beautiful and unique and offers a witness of the power of God and gives God honor and glory. You see, it's not just old-fashioned Southern hospitality. I don't know if this works in West Texas. I'll tell you how it works in North Carolina at Thanksgiving. Nobody talks about anything they disagree on. But gosh, the turkey is good. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people who allow the power of Christ to draw them toward one another in curiosity and love and openness, and in so doing show the world a more excellent way. It's not a way of dominance. It's not a way of insisting that everybody be just like me because I too have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. It's a world where we recognize that we all see through a mirror dimly, and our only hope is that in Jesus Christ. We have a calling now to be a kingdom of priests, a different kind of kingdom, a kingdom that doesn't work like we see on social media and witness on cable news and too often see in the halls of power. We have a chance to bring ourselves before God as an offering of praise. Now, at this point, you hope I see the clock, which I do. And at this point, you're probably thinking, for a guest preacher, he sure is political. I think that's what they were thinking when they heard the revelation. And I want to take a little issue with the characterization. I didn't really come here to give a political speech. I came here to participate in a Baptist revival. Because I also think, just like I'm pretty sure everybody here didn't vote the same way a few weeks ago, I'm pretty sure that most of our faith journey started about the same way. When I was 9 years old, at the Wake Forest Baptist Church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, one Sunday morning at the end of a sermon I don't remember, I walked the center aisle and extended my hand to the pastor, who was a friend of your former pastor, Hardy Clemens, by the way. And he said to me, "Paul, why are you here?" I said, "Jesus is Lord." Didn't understand what I was saying, didn't understand what I was getting into, but I felt like I was supposed to do it. As Baptist Christians, we begin our journeys by saying, Jesus is Lord. It all begins when we say, Jesus is ruler. Jesus, ruler of the kings of the earth. And the way it works is as we grow and live and learn, God gives us the courage to practice what we said. Right now, in this crazy world we live in, we need some people and we need some congregations, not just to say, Jesus is Lord, but to live like Revelation 1 is true. He's the ruler of the kings of earth, and all other ground is sinking sand.